Hi and welcome back to another episode of Elder Asks. Today we're going to have a wee look at 5 times governments were caught lying to the people through reports, investigations and whistleblowers, things that they've had to release to the people that's come out after the fact. First of all, before we go any further, so if you're a returning viewer, I'd like to say thank you for coming back and watching, and if you're not, I hope you enjoy the video. So we're going to get right into it, and we're going to start off with number 5, the Cuban Missile Disaster.
It's not hard to imagine a world where at any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal
So there you've just seen that there. That's basically the Cuban Missile Disaster. Now I have taken a few notes here, just things that you'd like to bring up about that. Now it's that was something that the CIA planned, that they took to John F. Kennedy, that what they were going to do is they were going to have false flag events where they would sink ships, they would bomb the public and blame another country, and also they would hijack planes. Now, so we've all heard that one before. So that's just a couple of the things that in 1962, the government was already floating the idea that we could do things like that to the public and nobody's really going to mind. Nobody's going to lose any sleep over it. Again, the reason why this actually happened, or why this was all supposedly going to happen, was because Russia put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, Russia put nuclear missiles in Cuba, but what they don't say is that is in retaliation to America putting nuclear missiles in Turkey, and after that, subsequently, they put it in Italy as well, I'm sure. So as Italy and Turkey both had American nuclear missiles at the same time as they're blaming Russia for putting the same thing. Now, remember at the time in 1962, America was involved in the Cold War with USSR and what's become known as Russia. And also, John F. Kennedy said no, and it's the reason it goes down in history that this never happened is that John F. Kennedy said no to this ever happening, and he shut the door on the plans. But John F. Kennedy said no to that because he didn't want a full-scale war with Russia. That's like the long and short of it. The actual quote, the reasoning behind that was, it'll cause a full-scale war with Russia, and we don't want that. It wasn't that we have to look after our people, we have to do right by our citizens, or we have to do anything whatsoever that's going to make the life for our citizens better. Is that they didn't want a full-scale war with Russia at that time because they knew Russia had nuclear weapons the same as them and stuff. So the idea that John F. Kennedy is like different to all the rest. Now, I do understand that he tried to make AIPAC the Israeli, they fund American politics, they put a lot of money into it, like, you know, they tried to make them register as a separate organisation, which, due to them getting assassinated, never ended up happening. And they tried to disband the CIA. Now, whether or not that's true, because it's easy to say it's like we want to disband the CIA when you see all the stuff the CIA is doing, and then you get a candidate that says we want to disband the CIA. He's going to be a fan favourite. He's going to win. He comes in, then he doesn't disband the CIA. You know what I mean? So you're seeing the same thing with Trump. He wants to take out the deep state. You're 7 years in, well, you're 6 years in to a presidency, and there's very little state, let alone deep state, being, you know, drained. So that was starting us off, number 5, the Cuban Missile Disaster. Straight after that, number 4, and I want to go to the war in Vietnam.
The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, or the USS Maddox Incident, is the event responsible for America's entry into the Vietnam War. Vietnam was divided into halves, North and South, ruled by separate regimes, but the United States were concerned that Ho Chi Minh and the Communists would win the upcoming elections and were determined to stop the spread of communism. U.S. military involvement, however, had been minimal until 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson had been training South Vietnamese mercenaries, sending them into North Vietnam to carry out acts of sabotage and gather intel. On July 31, 1964, South Vietnamese commandos had attacked North Vietnamese targets in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2, 1964, American naval destroyers had moved into North Vietnam waters to gather intelligence on the enemy's naval strength. The USS Maddox was nearing the mouth of the river Delta when Captain Herrick noticed that they were being followed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats and had intercepted communications of their intention to attack, so he fired 3 warning shots. The USS Maddox was then fired upon by the enemy torpedo boats. Captain Herrick retaliated and opened fire on the torpedo boats, and with the assistance of U.S. jet fighters, hit all 3 enemy targets. The enemy boats had fired their torpedoes, but they all missed. The USS Maddox then retreated back into international waters. 2 days later, a second patrol was launched into the Gulf of Tonkin by the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, when Captain Herrick reported that they were again under attack. Secretary McNamara and President Johnson agreed that retaliation was needed and the expansion of the war was approved by Congress. However, Herrick sent a later message claiming that he was mistaken about the attack and that freak weather action may have led his men to overreact. The final part of the message read, "No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Nevertheless, this was ignored by Johnson and his advisors, who continued on with the retaliation plan. On August 5th, Johnson made a public speech stating, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage." Shortly after his speech, U.S. aircraft bombed North Vietnamese targets, torpedo boat bases, and an oil storage depot. America was now drawn into the Vietnam War. President Johnson made a speech via the media to the American people to get their support for the war and described the attack on 2 U.S. Navy warships as a deliberate aggression. By late 1965, 200,000 American troops were on the ground, with more on the way.
Now that you've seen a little bit of the clip from, you know, the general story around the war in Vietnam, you know, it was South Vietnam and North Vietnam having a war between themselves. That's a civil war conflict. Why does America have to be involved? It goes that there's a ship, USS Maddox was off the coast of Vietnam what was happening is they're probably spying on them, keeping a look at what technology they have and stuff if they're at active war with another country. And so what they've done is apparently they've been attacked by Vietnamese. You've got to remember as well, back in them days, it's they probably didn't know who the ship belonged to, whatever they got there. It's a ship's coming into their sea, closer to their land and stuff like that there. They attacked them. The ship isn't sunk, but they'll still, they figured it out, everybody's absolutely fine, and then apparently there's a second attack on the USS Maddox, and there's also another ship involved at this point, the Turner Joy, USS Turner Joy. The only thing about that, so that's how America ended up getting into the Vietnamese War. Now the only thing about that is the captain of the ship of the USS Maddox said there was no second attack. The second one never happened. So he's come out and said the US government are saying, oh, we're going to war. We're diving feet first into this war. We're going to send ground troops on foot to that country, and a lot of them are going to die based off an attack that the captain of the ship who was supposedly attacked said we were never attacked for a second time. And again, it just shows it's the dodgy tactics, and it's what you'll probably find as well, the governments who took over both Vietnamese countries after that were very, very kind and very inviting when it came to American trade and, general American hospitalities and taking part in American deals and stuff like that. They became very, very open to that. The same as the sort of things you see like South Korea being very open to, deals, lucrative money markets and stuff like that there, whereas North Korea isn't. That's probably due to their alignment with America. It's you seem to find a trail. If you follow America, you follow money and the people that make the money, and that's pretty much how America ended up in war with Vietnam. Now that's probably one of America's most protested wars. Like, the people of the United States of America were not happy this war. It's like that, and again, it's, you see when things get covered up. No, that's the Summer of Love. That's Woodstock. That's when, you don't hear about all that. That's roughly around that time there, where it's like all this stuff's happening, and it's all based on, like, when they tell you history, it's like they'll go, oh, this massive thing happened. That's the Summer of Love and all that there. But yet there's these world-defining moments taking place, but the media tend to have you remember it in a certain different light. It's strange the way they do that. So that's number 4 out the way, and we're going to get straight on to number 3, the Tuskegee Trials. Now, if you've heard about the Tuskegee Trials, it's
the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, a study in unethical medicine. From 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was a study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service designed to study and observe the natural progression of humans infected with untreated syphilis. Conducted entirely on poor, uneducated African American men in and around Tuskegee, Alabama, the study was run in collaboration with Tuskegee University, then known as the Tuskegee Institute, which enrolled 600 African American sharecroppers from Macon County, Alabama, including 399 men with latent syphilis and a control group of 201 men who were syphilis-free. As an incentive for participation in the study, the men were promised free medical care, but were deceived by the U.S. Public Health Service, who disguised placebos, ineffective methods, and bogus diagnostic procedures as effective treatment options. The men who had syphilis were never informed about their diagnosis, despite the risk of infecting others, and they were never informed that the disease could lead to blindness, deafness, mental illness, heart disease, bone deterioration, central nervous system failure, and death. Instead, The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, which was a Southern colloquialism used to describe anemia and fatigue. After the introduction of penicillin in 1947, now the standard treatment for syphilis, none of the study participants were given the antibiotic, while scientists further prevented study participants from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to other residents in Macon County. After the unethical study was exposed by Cub Associated Press reporter Gene Heller, the American public was outraged to learn about numerous syphilis-related deaths in the infected study group, along with 40 wives who contracted the disease and 19 children born with congenital syphilis. The egregious breach in ethical standards led to major changes in U.S. law and regulations concerning the protection of participants in clinical studies, as well as the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protection.
So today, America does remember the hundreds of men used in research without their knowledge and consent. We remember them and their family members, men who were poor and African American, without resources and with few alternatives. They believed they had found hope when they were offered free medical care by the United States Public Health Service. They were betrayed.
So what do you even say about that? Again, that's another time where the government has given people a poison or injection or a disease, an illness, something like that there, just to use them as guinea pigs or lab rats. Now that's happened way too many times in history for it to be a mistake. You've got in this particular case, I think it was 600 black men were given syphilis, and so the idea was to see if you left it untreated, what would happen and how would it go and all that there. So now these people were trying to get treatment and stuff. There was obviously some sort of suffering involved, you know, if they had like a disease like that for just being left to like ravage on their body. Now at this time, the new penicillin did treat this, but they were still denied treatment. They were given placebos. They were but they were all part of this trial. They were all part of these trials. So, I suppose if they're taking part in the trial, they're probably going to their doctor, but they're going to a doctor, which they believe is a doctor, which they believe is giving them treatment for whatever is ailing them, because at that point they're not being told what it is, they don't know. Now the thing is about that there is 28 people ended up dying from that syphilis, and the strange thing is 19 kids were born with syphilis. Now, if you're giving people, the government, syphilis, and you're trying to see what it's like that you could maybe genetically modify humans to need treatment from day one, and you've just given birth to 19 babies with syphilis because you infected the previous, generation with syphilis, that's early genetic modification, that you're talking. Like that's basically what that trial came down to, is that what they can do and how it's that they've took the information from that. There was 19 babies born from that. That shows at least if there's this need to find this sort of stuff out, they're trying and they're using people to do it. And that leads me right on to my next one. This one's not so bad. This is Project Sunshine.
Learned how to split the atom, and the world had just learned how to split the atom, and with it, how to split the sky. In 1945, when the first mushroom cloud rose above New Mexico, scientists called it a dawn of power. But not everyone saw the sunrise. Some saw the fallout. Radioactive dust drifted across oceans, settled on grass, milk, and bone. Inside that dust hid a ghost element, strontium-90, a mimic of calcium that sank into human skeletons. The question haunting every nuclear lab was simple: how much of it is inside us? The official answer was silence. The secret answer became Project Sunshine. On paper, it sounded harmless, a global study of radioactive fallout. Behind closed doors, it meant collecting human tissue, bone samples mostly from infants and children to measure contamination. Between 1953 and the early 1960s, under the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and allied agencies, scientists quietly gathered specimens from more than a dozen countries. Hospitals, morgues, universities, each provided material, sometimes labeled unidentified cadaver, sometimes not labeled at all. Official memoranda later confirmed, consent was not always obtained. When reporters finally learned of the project years later, outrage followed. Parents asked, "Whose child did you take?" Officials replied with calm scientific language, "We needed global data to protect humanity." Some historians still defend that logic, saying the study saved lives by proving how fallout spread through the food chain. Others call it the coldest moral equation in science, sacrificing the voiceless to safeguard the living. Among researchers and ethicists, it became the case that changed medical consent laws forever. Yet, beyond the documents, another conversation grew, one whispered in forums, books, and late-night radio. Were all the samples accounted for? Did the program end when they said it did? People say some reports hint at later collection programs hidden under new names, that certain countries continued small-scale studies deep into the 1970s. None of it is proven, but the rumors persist because every declassified page seems to raise two new questions. Project Sunshine was born from fear of invisible dust, but its legacy glows brighter than anyone wanted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Its other name is Dead Baby Project. It's better known as Project Sunshine, but it's also known as the Dead Baby Project. Now, what that was is they took radiation. It was an early US government foundation. It was the US Atomic Energy Commission, and their mission was to see how radioactive fallout, especially strontium-90, accumulated in the human body and bones, and how it basically attached to the structure. Now, so the thing about this here is that the disturbing part of that is it was a worldwide thing where they were not only taking dead bodies and stuff and seeing, they also wanted to see how this radiation fallout would affect growing bones and bones that weren't quite as dense as they would be one day and stuff like that there. So what they done is they were taking dead bodies from parents who of children that are dead, but they were taking them without their permission, and they were cutting parts off the babies and stuff like that there, the young children. I think it went all up to the adolescent ages. So they were taking parts off, the children, then not letting the parents see them, and then it's the parents were wondering why all their children were going missing and all that there. And it turns out after reports and investigation that it was the government that was having them sent to these labs and these sites where they had concentrated radiation, and they were basically testing how radiation would or could affect your bones, your muscles, your skin tissue, basically seeing if it was harmful or any positives they could get out of it. They were exploring radiation. So we went all the way down and we finally got to number one, and it's probably the most famous one on the list, and it's hyped up by so many movies and stuff like that there, and it's Prohibition. I know it's probably a wee bit of a letdown after the last one, but it's Prohibition, and it lasted from 1920 to 1933, and here's just a wee clip. I'm just giving you a wee rundown of some of the things the government done back then.
There are incredible American stories forgotten by history, like how the U.S. government's effort to cure the ills of alcohol during Prohibition totally backfires. causing an epidemic of alcohol poisoning.
Industrial alcohol used in things like fuel and cologne quickly becomes the go-to solution during Prohibition for those looking to drink. But because of the poisonous additives meant to deter consumption, bootleggers are forced to filter the dangerous additives out.
What's left is pure ethyl alcohol, or grain alcohol. So bartenders then cleverly dress it up with flavors, popularizing classic American cocktails. The public loves it and keeps drinking.
The government, not willing to give in to the bootleggers' workaround, redoubles its efforts to make industrial alcohol from being consumable.
The federal government's response to this is unbelievable. What they do is they double the amount of poison in denatured alcohol.
They double the amount of poison.
They doubled the amount of poison, hoping that that would stop people from drinking it.
How many people do you think Prohibition alcohol poisoned?
We'll never know for certain. It could be, tens of thousands up to 100,000.
100,000 people. I mean, that's nearly the number that were killed of American soldiers that fought in World War I.
Unbelievably, yes. It's a travesty.
So why don't more people know about the Prohibition poisoning?
The U.S. government refused to take any responsibility for the poisonings, and rather laid blame on the drinkers. And bootleggers kept quiet in order to keep business afloat. In other words, no one wanted the story getting out. So it stayed that way, even after the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933, reversing Prohibition.
So here's a quick rundown of what happened in Prohibition. The government poisoned alcohol. Now, they poisoned it with concentrated alcohol, basically another type of alcohol, but it's still a poison. They knew it would kill people, and they give that out to the bootleggers. So they sold poisoned alcohol to the bootleggers, knowing that bootleggers were going to give it on to their custom. And they assumed that for whatever reason, the bootleggers just wouldn't give it to their customers because they're all nice people. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. What happened is they continued to do this, they continued to sell it, and essentially the US government continued to poison alcohol going forward. So it turned out there was actually roughly about 10,000 people died in this period of time through poisoned alcohol, not alcohol poisoning, poisoned alcohol. And again, it's that also, one of them things as well, is that it's an operation that ran from 1920 to 1933. That's a 13-year operation that ended in the year 33. That's not really lost on me, but the numbers and how the government's involved, stuff we got there. Now, so that's just 5 random ones off the top of my head that I can think of that the government's being forced to come out, tell us the truth, or declare documents, or whatever they've been forced to do. But it turns out it's not really what they've been telling us the whole time. And it turns out, as you see in all these cases, there's always the government messing around, fucking around with people, doing things they shouldn't in order to get what they want. Now, in fact, what I'll do here is I'll put a wee quick clip in now of a list of all the times the CIA, one organization, have had to admit, lying to the American people. And I know people go, oh, why America? Why? It's very relevant here because it's the same people that are involved at the top. But I'll give you a wee list here. Now, there's probably, I don't know how many's on the list because I haven't even brought it up yet, but you can see here it's an extensive list of things that the CIA have done that have been forced to admit, operations that they've, took advantage of people, even like the MK Ultra thing, which is probably the most famous one. That started off with them drugging people that went into brothels against their knowledge and stuff like that there. That was never, willing participants. And so now we've just seen there a list of all the times the CIA have been forced to admit to the people that they were taking advantage of them or using their taxpayer money to poison them or something like that there. And the reason I actually picked these 5 now is I didn't pick them specifically for this, but if you look at the way the world is today and you look at these 5 things, now just to run you back through the Cuban Missile Disaster. Now, we've got the Cuban Missile Disaster, and that shows they are willing to bomb you, no doubt. They wouldn't suggest it if they weren't. They're willing to sink the ships that brings your food. They're willing to sink the ships that brings your oil. You can't get petrol, you can't go to work. So they're willing to do that. They're willing to do that in 1962. And then the other thing that also comes up with the Cuban Missile disaster is they were also willing and had the idea to hijack planes in 1962, something that ended up happening in September 2001. And if you, many believe that's like that was so obvious to a lot of people that was the gateway that got them into thinking something's not right. So it's not even as if it's like, oh, that's a conspiracy. It's like, it might be a conspiracy, but it's a very, very clear one, you know. And the reason, so even the Cuban Missile disaster in 1962 shows that they were willing to do something like 9/11 already back then. And the only reason it didn't happen is because JFK stood in the way. And remember, it's that JFK stood in the way because he didn't want war with Russia, not because he didn't want to save, or not because he wanted to not harm Americans. It was because he didn't want war with Russia. The Vietnam War shows they're willing to fake any attacks it is. So when you see the news today and you see, oh, this happened, that, you don't know. They could have done it to themselves, they could have done it themselves. It might never have happened. It could be CGI, it can be, you know, artificial videos. Today you'll never ever know, but that's prevalent because you know they're at least willing to do it to themselves in order to make you think that someone else done it to them. And then it brings it down a wee bit as well. So now that's like militarily. When you look at the government and stuff we got there, so them first two examples are militarily. So that shows you how they're willing to use the government and the military against you as, you know, a citizen of the country. That shouldn't ever be the case. Now, you take the likes of the Dead Baby Project, that shows that they were looking at radiation 75 years ago. So when this happened, they were basically, I think it was just after the war, the World War, and they were already looking at radiation. Now, you look at today and you see how it's, you get microwaves in your house and you get Wi-Fi in your house and you've got 5G towers and all that there, and you say, oh, it's just internet, it's not harmful, it can't be harmful, you know, it does everything. You go, maybe, but why have these people, we know radiation is harmful, so it's never, here's the thing, it might, people who you don't believe it's harmful, right, even those that do, nobody's saying, oh, it's going to kill you right away or whatever that there. It's, you know, people are saying it's a net negative more than a net positive. There's nothing positive it does for your health, but it actually detriments your health because of the radiation coming off these poles and stuff we got there. Also, there's a bit of a switch goes on there because people don't realise that the CIA were talking about 5G weapons in 1975, and I think that's where people get the crossover and like that there. So yeah, so they're both obviously 5G, but they're not the same type of weapons. But that's also a wee bit strange, the fact that when you think that they were looking into and investigating the effects of radiation on small kids developing bones, only to absolutely litter society with these radiation towers. What did they find when they were doing their, you know, what did they find when they were doing their experiments, their reports and stuff like that there? They must have found something that they think could have been beneficial for them. You know what I mean? They must have found something, otherwise they wouldn't have had towers every 200, 300 yards when the roads themselves aren't even, they've got hardly any concrete on them or tarmac or, I don't even know what synthetic material are making roads out, and you know what I mean? But it seems to me, like, especially through COVID when they actually put these up, it seems to me that it must have been self-serving because it was a weird time to prioritise putting 5G towers up. And again, just because everything I know about the government so far, and even just the 5 things I've told you now, it's like no matter what they do, it's my first reaction is always going to be skepticism. And that brings us on to finally the Tuskegee trials. And so, to be honest, the Tuskegee trial and the prohibition, I could probably just like sort of lump them in together and sort of like point out that not only are they willing to give you a disease, not only are they willing to give you a disease, make you live with it, and then see if they can fix it, they're also willing to poison you to death because you're not following what they're telling you. Now, they poisoned all the alcohol because they wanted people not to drink the alcohol. So because people drank the alcohol that they told them not to, they were happy for them to die. That's essentially it is. So the government made the choice that they would rather have people die and do what they say than be perfectly fine to drink alcohol but disobey what they were saying. So they made that conscious decision. And again, the thing with the Tuskegee trials as well, it's like not only did 20 people actually die with syphilis in the end, when they actually, like, of syphilis, not with the symptoms or anything like that, that was the cause of death, but there was actually 19 babies born with syphilis. And that strikes me as strange, because if that, like, when you look at, like, Bill Gates, and so you've got all these ones that are, so the Bill Gates Foundation, it's like Epstein himself, it's like, oh, the Clintons, it's like they're all into eugenics and this sort of stuff here. So when you see that the government 100 years ago were doing trials that they happened to give people sexually transmitted disease, and then there was babies born with it, and you think to yourself today, it's like, why does a baby in the UK get a hepatitis C jab? Why would any baby in the UK need a sexually transmitted disease inoculation when born? So it's the way I see it, they either don't have it, or sorry, they either have it and everybody's got hep C, therefore everybody's born with sexually transmitted disease, and they give you the inoculation at the beginning so your body can fight against it, or you're born and you don't have it and they give you the genes. And if you think about when you go with the syphilis and stuff like that, there, it's like people aren't treating kids for sexually transmitted diseases. So it's like, in a conservative side, you maybe get 18 years, 15, 16, 17 years, depending on people's promiscuity, about when they lose their virginity and stuff like that there, before anybody's even looking or thinking or talking about maybe this condition that's been making me feel bad or whatever is a sexually transmitted one, because they've never had sex or never been touched, and they don't know what, so nobody's going to look at someone who's quite clearly never had sex before and go, oh, it's a sexually transmitted disease. But if they're giving them the hepatitis C right from day birth and then not treating them for 18 years and it's just growing inside their body, it's like, things like that makes you think. So that's what I'm saying, is that either, if they don't have it, then why are you giving them it? Because surely to me as well, it's as if anybody else can get rid of hepatitis C with a penicillin jab now, why are we giving it to kids? Because if you don't give younger generations it, the only thing that can happen is it's going to fall, because more people in society is not going to have it, therefore it's going to fall and fall and fall and fall, and that's how something becomes irrelevant. But you only keep something going if you continue to give the kids it every single jab. So, or every time a kid's born, they get that jab. So there we have it. That's today's video, and that's 5 times the government has lied to the people, and it's a wee link in how, like, just these 5 are very prominent in today's society. So that's 5 times the government be forced to tell us the truth, or 5 times we've found out the truth from the government. I want to know in the comments, what do you think? So what do you think they found out with the radiation trials, what effects it has on your bone density and stuff like that there? So what's your thoughts on the Cuban Missile Crisis? Fuck Cuba, we're never going there anyway. write down in the comments, let me know what you think. So like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.